Have you ever experienced a loss so deep that it felt like time itself couldn't heal it? Brandon, a seasoned detective, thought he had come to terms with the death of his only son, Logan, until an unexpected discovery shakes everything he believed to be true. Two young girls crying over a grave that bears his son's name, but claim it's their father's. How could this be? Stay with me as we unravel this heart-wrenching mystery together. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe because this story will leave you thinking about what you would do if this happened to you. Brandon walked silently through the hallways of the Dallas cemetery. The gentle wind rustled the fallen leaves as his footsteps echoed on the uneven ground. His calloused and heavy hands held a bouquet of fresh flowers and an old photo of Logan, his only son. 4 years had passed since that day when the boating accident ripped him from Brandon's life. And although time had moved on, the pain remained fresh, as if it had all happened yesterday. Brandon had been a detective for over 20 years, but neither his experience nor his training, nor his ability to unravel the darkest mysteries had prepared him for the emptiness left by the loss of his son. He approached the grave, a simple headstone with Logan's name etched upon it. "Logan," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the faded letters. He placed the flowers carefully beside the stone, with the almost ritualistic precision of someone who had repeated the same act time and time again. The faded photo of Logan lingered in his hands for a moment longer, as if merely holding it could draw him closer to the memories that seemed to fade with each passing year. He was about to kneel when a soft noise pulled him from his thoughts. Faint sobs drifted from a nearby corner of the cemetery. He lifted his head, turning his neck to identify the source. It was uncommon to see many people in this place, especially at this hour. His eyes landed on two little girls, standing in front of a nearby grave. They were crying. At first, Brandon tried to ignore it, but the intensity of their weeping prevented him from focusing on his own grief. Something compelled him to approach. The girls, twins from what he could gather, had red faces from crying, their small hands intertwined. Brandon could hear some of the words they spoke through their sobs. "Why is the name wrong?" one of them asked, while the other looked at her, confused. "Daddy wasn't named Logan." Brandon's heart skipped a beat upon hearing that name. He stopped dead in his tracks, just a few steps away from them. From where he stood, he could see the headstone before which they were weeping. And there, in the same letters he knew all too well, was Logan's name. And these girls, these twins, were saying that their father wasn't named that. Before he could process what was happening, a tall woman with a pale, weary face appeared behind the girls. "Karen, Ashley, that's enough." Her voice was soft but laden with sorrow. When she lifted her gaze, she met Brandon's. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't mean to bother you. My daughters, we're here visiting their father's grave, but I've always found it strange to see the name on the headstone," the woman said, visibly uncomfortable. "My husband, he passed away 4 years ago in an accident, and since then I've been coming here with them, but I've never been able to explain why the name doesn't match." Brandon felt something tear inside him. Logan's accident had occurred exactly 4 years ago. The same amount of time this woman said she had been visiting this grave. "Excuse me, are you sure this is the correct grave?" he asked, unsure of what else to say. The woman, now realizing that something was off, stepped closer to the headstone. "I thought so at first. After the accident, as when everything was chaos, I didn't pay attention. I was shattered. I just came here because I was told this was the place. Since then, we've come every year, but I could never explain why the name didn't match." Brandon stared at the grave, trying to piece together the story in his mind. Everything pointed to a mistake, but the coincidence was too unsettling. Logan had been buried here. He knew that for certain. So, who was the man Elizabeth and her daughters visited every year? Brandon's mind began to race, just as it had so many times before when he worked on complicated cases as a detective. Something in this story didn't fit. It wasn't just a confusion over the name on the headstone. It was much deeper. It was as if a hidden truth had been mocking him all this time. "We need to find out what happened here," he finally said, his voice now firm. The twins looked at him, not entirely understanding what was happening, but Elizabeth nodded. aware that they were on the brink of uncovering something much larger. Brandon couldn't tear his gaze away from Elizabeth and the twins, Karen and Ashley, who stood beside the grave with a mixture of confusion and sadness on their faces. He knew that the weight of grief wasn't something that could be easily lifted, but the doubt that had settled in their minds and his had to be resolved. With the instinct of a detective still alive within him, even though he had stepped back from the role, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper and darker might be at play. "Listen, Elizabeth, let me help you figure this out," Brandon said, his voice steady but filled with an odd compassion. "What you're saying, I can't ignore it. We need to know who is buried here and why Logan's name is on this headstone." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes slightly wet. It was clear she had been carrying a mix of pain, confusion, and resignation for years. She had never dared to question what seemed to be a simple mistake, but now, with Brandon by her side, the question she always avoided became impossible to ignore. "I don't know how to thank you, but yes, I need to know the truth. I can't keep living with this doubt," Elizabeth replied, looking at her daughters with a blend of sadness and determination. The girls remained silent, unable to grasp the magnitude of the moment, but sensing that something important was unfolding. Brandon shot them a glance, his heart aching at the vulnerability they radiated. He owed them answers, to them and to his own son. "Let's go to the cemetery office. They should have the records," suggested Brandon. Elizabeth nodded, and without further words, they began walking toward the small administrative office near the cemetery entrance. The journey was silent, interrupted only by the sound of their footsteps on the gravel path. Brandon walked ahead, his mind racing through possible scenarios, but each one seemed stranger than the last. If there had been an error with the headstones, it meant someone else could be buried in Logan's plot, and that idea sent a chill down his spine. When they arrived at the office, a middle-aged employee greeted them with a neutral expression, as if he was used to dealing with tragedies on a daily basis. "Good morning. How can I help you?" he asked, observing Brandon and Elizabeth with mild curiosity. Brandon, straightforward, got right to the point. "We need to review the burial records. There's a confusion with a headstone, and we need to confirm who is buried in the grave." The employee raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Brandon's direct tone. "Well, errors with headstones have happened in the past, but I'll need more details. Which grave are you questioning?" "It's my son's grave, Logan," Brandon replied, his voice hardening at the mention of the name. It still hurt to say it. "But this woman," he gestured to Elizabeth, "has been visiting the same grave for years, believing her husband is buried there." The employee frowned and straightened in his chair, visibly more attentive. "That's unusual. Let me check the files." As the employee began typing on the computer, the silence in the small office grew heavier. Elizabeth glanced sideways at Brandon, unable to hide the nervousness that was beginning to consume her. Karen and Ashley, clutching their mother's hand, seemed to sense that something important was about to happen, though their young minds couldn't grasp the magnitude of it all. Brandon felt a growing pressure in his chest. For the first time in years, his detective instincts were on high alert, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, something that couldn't be explained as just an administrative error. "Here are the records," the employee said, looking at his computer screen. "According to the data, the grave with Logan's name belongs to a man named Logan, obviously. But..." He paused, looking perplexed. "The burial paperwork shows inconsistencies. The deceased's name matches, but the dates and some details don't quite add up. It's not common, but it has happened before for names to get mixed up on headstones." Brandon felt a knot in his stomach. That wasn't enough. He needed more. "Can we see those papers? We need to know exactly what happened." The employee nodded and got up from his seat to head to the physical files. While they waited, Brandon leaned toward Elizabeth. "Do you remember anything about the day your husband was buried? Was there any confusion or anything that seemed off?" Elizabeth took a moment to respond, her eyes clouded with memories. "Everything happened so fast. I was told he died in an accident and that they had recovered his body. I couldn't see him. They wouldn't allow it. The funeral home handled everything, and I was in shock. I only went through the motions." I don't even remember seeing the headstone until the following year." Brandon frowned. That was unusual, but not impossible. After all, people who suffer a sudden loss often feel disoriented and tend to rely on others to handle the details. The employee returned with a folder in hand and placed it in front of them. "Here are the original documents. You can review them. But from what I see, it looks like someone may have confused identities at some point in the process." Brandon took the papers and began to review them with Elizabeth by his side. What they found only heightened their unease. The burial records for Logan and Elizabeth's husband showed similarities in dates and circumstances, but also had conflicting details. The name of the hospital where the bodies were taken, the exact dates of the accident, and the location where it occurred. "This doesn't make sense," Brandon murmured, rubbing his face in frustration. "The dates don't match, and the places don't either. Someone made a mistake, or something much bigger is going on here." Elizabeth, on the verge of tears, shook her head. "I can't believe I've been visiting a grave for 4 years, and I don't even know if it's the right one." Brandon looked at the employee, who seemed as bewildered as they were. "We're going to need more information. This isn't over." The employee nodded, understanding. "I can request a deeper investigation. If there's been a mix-up with the headstones or the records, we need to resolve it as soon as possible." Brandon knew this was just the beginning. That day, when they left the cemetery, Brandon and Elizabeth, with the girls, decided to conduct a DNA test on the remains buried under Logan's name. Brandon leaned back in his chair as he looked at the paper with the official request for the DNA test. The process had been slower than he expected, but at least it was underway. The tension in his body built with each passing day without answers. Across the small office, Elizabeth watched her daughters play quietly. The worry was palpable on her face, but what Brandon couldn't help but notice was the emotional exhaustion that seemed to have enveloped her since their encounter at the cemetery. "This is all we can do right now," he said, trying to break the heavy silence. "As soon as we have the results, we'll know the truth. We can't rush it any more than we already have." Elizabeth nodded, though her gaze remained lost somewhere between reality and memories. I know, she murmured. "But I can't stop thinking about Anthony. His death, everything that happened in those days. I've convinced myself that something was wrong, but at that moment, I was too broken to see it." Brandon straightened in his chair, intrigued. He had heard many people talk about instincts they ignored, and his detective instincts told him that Elizabeth might be onto something important. "What do you mean?" he asked softly. Elizabeth took a few seconds to respond. "Before Anthony died, something changed in him. It wasn't much, but I noticed he started getting calls I couldn't explain. He always said they were work-related, but he didn't behave like he normally did with work matters. He got nervous, cut off calls quickly, and then changed the subject. I didn't pay attention back then. I guess I trusted him." Brandon felt a slight chill run down his spine. This didn't sound like a mere coincidence. "How long before his death did those calls start?" he asked, leaning slightly forward, hoping for more details. Elizabeth closed her eyes and frowned, trying to piece together the events. "It was shortly before the accident, maybe 2 weeks prior. He was acting strangely, avoiding my questions a bar, and sometimes he seemed distracted. I thought it was just the stress of work. He always said things were tense, but now that I think about it, I'm not so sure." Brandon knew that kind of behavior, especially right before a tragedy, was a red flag that couldn't be ignored. Coincidences were rare when it came to inexplicable behaviors like that. "Was there anything else?" he pressed, knowing that small details could be crucial. Elizabeth sighed deeply, as if bringing to light memories she had kept buried for years. "One night just before the accident, Anthony came home late. He said he had to sort something out, but didn't give me any details. I noticed he was anxious, like he was hiding something. He told me not to worry and that he'd be back soon, but when he returned, he was different. He seemed relieved, as if he had done something that freed him from a burden." Brandon squinted. "Did he ever tell you what he was doing that night?" "No, and I didn't ask," Elizabeth replied, her voice heavy with regret. "I suppose I was busy with the girls and everything else. I just let it go." The silence that followed was thick. Brandon could see the guilt in Elizabeth's eyes, a guilt that may have always been there but was now finding new reasons to exist. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed still made no sense. Anthony's strange behavior before his death, the mysterious calls, his nervous demeanor, it all pointed to something he was hiding. "Don't blame yourself for not seeing it before," Brandon said, knowing well how guilt could consume a person. "You couldn't have known what was happening, none of us can, but now we need to focus on what we know and what we'll discover with the results." Elizabeth nodded, though her gaze remained heavy with sorrow. The girls continued to play, unaware of the gravity of what was unfolding around them. Brandon couldn't help but think about the impact this would have on them if the worst-case scenario turned out to be true. If the man buried in the grave wasn't the father they had believed to visit for years, their entire reality could collapse. Is there any chance Anthony was involved in something dangerous?" Elizabeth suddenly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon didn't respond immediately. He knew that the answer to that question could be devastating, but it was something they had to consider. "It's hard to say without more information," he replied carefully. "But if he was, there must have been a significant reason. We can't jump to conclusions until we have more evidence." Elizabeth lowered her head, biting her lower lip as she tried to process what he was saying. Brandon felt his own tension rise, not just from the case itself, but from the emotional weight it carried for both families. The DNA results were their only hope for concrete answers, but until then, they could only speculate. Days passed, and the wait for the results was becoming unbearable. Each call they received from the hospital or the cemetery office made Elizabeth jump, while Brandon tried to maintain his composure, though he felt the same anxiety inside. During those days, Elizabeth began to talk more about the last moments she shared with Anthony. Little details kept surfacing: late-night calls, furtive meetings, half-finished conversations. Everything that had once seemed normal now took on a suspicious hue. One afternoon, Elizabeth recalled something else. "There was a time I found a strange piece of paper in his pocket," she said suddenly, as they were having coffee in the kitchen. "It was just a phone number, no name. I threw it away because it didn't seem important, but now, I wonder if I should have asked more." Brandon felt something stir within him. An anonymous phone number was an important detail, especially coming from someone who seemed to be hiding things. "Do you remember the number?" he asked cautiously, knowing the odds of her remembering were slim. Elizabeth shook her head. "No, it was so long ago, but I was left with the feeling that something wasn't right. I never mentioned it, never investigated. I was blinded by trust." Brandon pressed his lips together. The accumulation of small details that Elizabeth was beginning to recall pointed to something larger, but they still couldn't see the complete picture. And as long as they didn't have the DNA results, everything would remain conjecture. However, one thing was clear: there were many unanswered questions, and with each passing day, those questions seemed to multiply. "We just have to wait," Brandon murmured, though the words sounded empty even to him. Elizabeth looked at him with a mix of gratitude and despair, knowing her life was about to change, one way or another. The sound of the phone echoed in the room, jolting Brandon from a light, restless sleep. He had been waiting for that call for days, but now that the moment had arrived, he felt a mix of anxiety and dread. He jumped up, grabbed his phone, and without even checking who was calling, answered in a hoarse, tired voice. "Brandon? It's Dr. Nichols." The voice on the other end was professional, but there was a tension that couldn't be ignored. "We have the results of the DNA test." Brandon took a deep breath, feeling his heart begin to race. He said nothing, just waited for the doctor to continue. "The remains," Dr. Nichols said, pausing longer than necessary, "the remains buried under Logan's headstone are, in fact, those of your son." "I'm so sorry, Brandon." A mix of emotions overwhelmed him in that moment. On one hand, there was relief in knowing that his son, Logan, was truly there where he had always believed, buried beneath that cold gravestone he visited every year. But on the other hand, He felt a stab of guilt and pain for Elizabeth and her daughters. They had been visiting that grave for 4 years, believing that their husband and father was there, when in reality, Logan's body occupied that spot. "Thank you, Doctor," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. He ended the call and stared at the phone in his hand, trying to process what it all meant. Despite the relief of having an answer, the situation was far from resolved. Where was the body of the girl's father? How could such a mistake have happened? And, most importantly, what had really happened to Anthony? He headed to the kitchen where Elizabeth and the girls were seated at the table, waiting with the same anxiety he felt. Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice breaking with uncertainty. Brandon paused, taking a moment to find the right words. But what could he say? There was no easy way to soften the blow that was coming next. "The remains in the grave are Logan's," he said, his voice steady but low. Elizabeth's face transformed into a mask of disbelief and horror. Her eyes, which just moments before held a glimmer of hope, dimmed upon hearing the truth. The girls, Karen and Ashley, exchanged glances, too young to fully grasp the weight of what had just been said, but knowing that something terrible had occurred. "Tanis," Elizabeth murmured, shaking her head as if that could change what she had just heard. "I've been visiting that grave all these years, believing that—" Her voice broke, unable to continue. Brandon felt a lump in his throat. Although he knew this was what he had feared from the beginning, witnessing its impact on Elizabeth and the girls was overwhelming. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth," he said, unsure of what else to say. "Jay, I don't know how this happened, but it's clear that someone made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Logan is buried there, but that means we don't know where your husband is." Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, trying to hold back her tears, but it was evident that the situation had overwhelmed her. The girls moved closer to her, scared to see their mother so vulnerable. "Where is Dad then?" Ashley asked, her small voice trembling with confusion. Brandon was left speechless. There was no easy answer, no explanation that could bring them peace at that moment. But one thing was clear: there were more questions than answers, and none of them could be ignored. Elizabeth lowered her hands, revealing a tear-streaked face but with a look of determination. "We have to find out what happened. I can't keep living without knowing where Anthony is. If his body isn't in that grave, then where is it?" Her voice, though shaky, now carried a tone of resolve. Brandon nodded slowly. He had hoped the DNA test results would bring some sort of closure, at least for him. But it was clear that this was not an ending. It was just the beginning of something much more complicated. "Now, the first thing we need to do is review the burial records, the accident details, everything we can find," Brandon said, taking up his role as detective again. "Something must have gone wrong at some point in the process, and we need to find out what it was." Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Yes, you're right, but where do we start? It's been 4 years since Anthony died, or at least that's what I was told. Everything was handled by the funeral home, and they never gave me a reason to doubt what they said." Brandon thought for a moment. He knew they would have to face legal and bureaucratic obstacles, and perhaps even personal ones, but none of that deterred him. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of paperwork and decisions made years ago. The gravestone error was no coincidence. Someone had failed, and he needed to discover who and why. "We'll start by contacting the funeral home and the authorities involved in Anthony's accident," he said, mentally organizing the next steps. "We'll review all the documents, the death certificates, and if necessary, we'll speak with everyone who was involved in that process." Elizabeth looked at him, grateful for his determination but still overwhelmed by the situation. "Thank you, Brandon. I don't know how we'd do this without you." Brandon shook his head. "Don't thank me. We still have a lot to uncover, and this doesn't end until we know the truth." The girls clung to their mother, still confused by everything that was happening. Elizabeth hugged them tightly, trying to hold back her own fears so as not to scare them more than they already were. "We're going to find him," Elizabeth said, more to herself than to the girls. "We're going to uncover what happened." Brandon nodded, looking at the fractured family before him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, and the answers they found might not be what they expected. But one thing was clear: they weren't going to stop until they found the real Anthony, no matter what that revealed about the last days of his life. With one last glance at the girls, Brandon stepped out of the house, determined to initiate the search. The truth, however painful it might be, was the only thing that could bring them peace. And deep down, he knew that what they would find would not only change Elizabeth and her daughter's lives, but also his own. The fresh morning air mingled with the distant sound of traffic as Brandon and Elizabeth walked down one of the oldest streets in Dallas. Around them, the brick buildings stood as silent witnesses to the history they were about to uncover. They had spent the last few weeks gathering fragments of information that only seemed to raise more questions than answers. However, one thing was clear: Anthony had not died in that accident, as Elizabeth had believed for 4 years. The truth was much more complex and dangerous. "I can't believe Anthony was involved in something like this," Elizabeth murmured as she walked alongside Brandon, looking down at the ground, lost in her thoughts. "I always thought he was just a hard-working man, a good father. How did I not see anything?" Brandon glanced at her, understanding her feelings of guilt. After so many years as a detective, he had learned that people could lead hidden lives that even their closest loved ones might never discover. But he knew that in many cases, these individuals acted out of desperation or to protect their families, as seemed to be the case with Anthony. "Sometimes people get into trouble they can't easily escape from," Brandon said, his voice calm but firm. "It seems that Anthony did what he believed was necessary to keep you and the girls safe. Faking his death was probably his only way out." Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. There was so much to process, and the revelation that her husband had been involved with criminals hit her with an unyielding force. For years, she had mourned his death, taking their daughters to that grave believing it held the man she loved, only to discover it had all been a lie. But why? What kind of danger had Anthony faced that led him to make such an extreme decision? "Tell me this will end soon, Brandon. That will uncover the truth," Elizabeth murmured, almost pleading. Brandon nodded, but deep down, he knew that what they were uncovering was much darker than Elizabeth could imagine. He had seen people fall into the clutches of criminal organizations before, and rarely did the story have a happy ending. The day before, after weeks of investigation, they had discovered that Anthony had been linked to a network of organized crime. His seemingly ordinary job at a security company had led him to come into contact with dangerous individuals, and according to the information Brandon had gathered, Anthony had begun receiving threats against himself and his family just before he died. It was clear he had tried to protect Elizabeth and the girls from something he couldn't control. "This is it," Brandon said, pointing to an old warehouse at the end of a narrow street. The place was dark and forgotten, as if time had stood still there. The windows were coated in dust, and the rusty metal door creaked when Brandon pushed it open. According to his sources, this warehouse had been one of the last places Anthony was seen before disappearing. It was known among the city's underbelly as a site for illegal transactions and meetings between crime figures. "Are you sure you want to go through with this, Elizabeth?" Brandon asked before stepping inside. He knew that what they would find wouldn't be easy to digest. "We could stop here, but once you cross that door, there's no turning back." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with determination, though the fear was still evident in her gaze. "I need to know the truth. If Anthony did all this to protect us, I deserve to know why." Brandon nodded and pushed the door open with more force. The metallic screech echoed in the empty space as they entered. The interior was deserted, but traces of past activity were evident: stacked boxes, empty bottles, and a dusty desk in the corner. Brandon approached the desk and began sifting through old papers and abandoned documents. Elizabeth stood silently, scanning every corner of the place, hoping to find a clue that would connect her to her husband. "Here's something," Brandon suddenly said, pulling a sheet of paper from the bottom of a drawer. It was an old employment contract, but what caught his attention was Anthony's name, clearly written at the top. The contract appeared to be with a private security company, But what stood out was the name of the person who had signed it, a figure known by local authorities to be linked to organized crime. "What does this mean?" Elizabeth asked, frowning at the document. Brandon sighed, realizing that Anthony's troubles were more serious than they had imagined. "It means Anthony was working for someone dangerous, and if I'm right, he was probably trying to get out of that life when the threat started coming in." Elizabeth pressed her lips together, struggling to contain the emotions that welled up from this new revelation. The man she had loved, the father of her daughters, had been involved with criminals, and in a desperate attempt to escape that world, he had faked his death. But the fact that they now knew this meant someone else did too, and the people involved in those kinds of networks rarely forgave those who betrayed them or tried to escape. "What do we do now?" Elizabeth asked, aware that every step they took brought them closer to danger. "We have to keep investigating. If Anthony faked his death, someone must have helped him. I can't just disappear without assistance, especially when you're fleeing from a criminal organization," Brandon replied, studying the contract closely. They continued to search the warehouse, finding more documents that confirmed what Brandon had already suspected. Anthony had been pressured by this network of criminals, and when things got too dangerous, he had made a deal to disappear. He had likely assumed a new identity, but the cost of that decision was steep. Now Jean, with Elizabeth and the girls seeking answers, they risked attracting the same criminals who had threatened Anthony to ensure that the truth never came to light. "We're close, Elizabeth, but this is going to get more dangerous," Brandon said as they stepped out of the warehouse. The midday sun greeted them with blinding intensity, but the cold knot in Brandon's stomach only grew tighter. Elizabeth nodded, knowing that what lay ahead wouldn't be easy. There was no turning back. They were entangled in a dangerous web, and although the truth was beginning to surface, the safety of her family hung by a thread. As they walked back to the car, Brandon paused for a moment, scanning their surroundings. He knew they were now being watched, and in the world of organized crime, no one walked away unscathed when the truth began to be uncovered. The wind whipped fiercely, stirring up dust around the abandoned property as Elizabeth and Brandon moved along the gravel path, their hearts pounding. They had come a long way to reach this point, and now uncertainty mingled with hope and fear in their chests. Everything they had discovered over the past weeks had led them to this place. In front of them, a crumbling building stood in the middle of nowhere, its rusted, neglected facade the only witness to the shadows of the past. Brandon looked at Elizabeth, his eyes reflecting a mix of concern and support. He knew that for her, this moment would change everything. Finding Anthony, after 4 years of believing him dead, was not something easy to process. But there they were, on the brink of facing the truth they had sought for so long. "Are you ready?" Brandon asked, his voice hoarse from the effort of keeping calm. Elizabeth nodded, though her body trembled slightly. It had been so long imagining this moment, and now that it was about to happen, she felt her legs might give out. But her love for Anthony and the desire to protect her family pushed her to move forward. "I have to see him, Brandon. I need to know he's okay," she said, her determination masking the inner chaos she felt. They crossed the threshold of the building, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Every corner of the place spoke of abandonment, of forgotten stories, but also of buried secrets. As they approached the interior, the sound of the rusty door creaking open filled the air. In the dim light, a figure moved slowly. Brandon squinted, trying to focus, and then he saw him. Anthony was there, standing in a corner. His face, though marked by time and suffering, was unmistakable. Elizabeth let out a choked gasp, her eyes brimming with tears. The man she had mourned for years, the man she had loved, was standing right in front of her, alive. "Anthony," she whispered, taking a step closer to him. Anthony slowly lifted his gaze, and their eyes met. His face hardened as he saw the emotions radiating from her, but the pain in his own eyes was evident. He knew he couldn't avoid what was about to happen. The moment of truth had arrived. "Elizabeth." His voice was soft, broken, as if the words weighed too much. Brandon took a step back, respecting the space they needed for this reunion. Though his heart was moved, he knew this moment didn't belong to him. This was between Anthony and Elizabeth, between the truth and the love that had been tested in the cruelest way possible. Elizabeth approached Anthony slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for him. I thought you were dead. I've cried for you every day. The girls, they've cried for you." Anthony lowered his head, unable to hold his wife's gaze. The words were hard to come by, but he knew he had to be honest. He couldn't keep hiding the truth. "You have no idea how hard it's been for me too," he murmured. "Faking my death was the only way I found to protect them. I got involved in something I couldn't handle, something that put our family in danger. If they had found me, they wouldn't just have finished me off. They would have taken you too. It was the only option." Elizabeth stepped back, trying to process what she was hearing. Part of her understood. She realized why he had done it. But another part, the one that had suffered for years, couldn't easily accept what had happened. "And your only option was to leave us?" she asked, her voice trembling with contained fury. "To let us think you were dead, without giving us any explanation. Do you really think that was best for us, for the girls?" Anthony looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "No, it wasn't the best. I know that. But at that moment, I thought it was the only thing I could do. I couldn't forgive myself if something happened to you." Elizabeth stared at him, her face a mix of pain and love. She wanted to hate him for what he had done, for having left them without a word for so long, but the fear in his eyes, the remorse in his voice, kept her from doing so. "The girls need their father," she said, calmer now, though her voice still carried pain. "I need you, Anthony. I can't keep living with this uncertainty. I can't keep going like this." Anthony winced. His body hunched as if the weight of Elizabeth's words crushed him. He stepped closer, his trembling hands reaching for hers. "I want to come back, Elizabeth. I've wanted to since the day I left, but I couldn't. I knew that doing so would put your lives in danger. The people who are looking for me are still out there. They won't stop until they find me." Elizabeth looked at him in silence, feeling the weight of the decision they were about to make. She knew that Anthony's return would bring more dangers, but she also knew she couldn't let him continue living this way, hidden and separated from his family. "We can't keep running," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "If we're going to get through this, we'll do it together. But I need you to promise me that you won't disappear again." Brandon, who had been listening from a corner, stepped forward. He knew that the situation wouldn't resolve itself simply with Anthony's return. The people who were after him were still out there, and they wouldn't rest until they settled their scores. "Anthony, this isn't going to be easy. The people you got involved with aren't the forgiving type. But I can help you," Brandon said, his years as a detective lending confidence to his words that Anthony and Elizabeth needed to hear. "We can find a way to ensure they don't come after you anymore, but we need to be careful. We have to make smart decisions." Anthony nodded, grateful but still uncertain about how to proceed. He knew he didn't have many options, but having Brandon on his side gave him a small glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Brandon. I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done for my family," Anthony said, his voice trembling with emotion. Brandon shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. I'm doing this because I know what it's like to lose someone important. And even though my son isn't here, I want you to have the chance to be with your family." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Elizabeth looked at Anthony and then at Brandon, realizing that this man, despite his own loss, was willing to help them reclaim what was left of their family. "We'll do this together," Elizabeth finally said, with the strength of a woman who had endured too much pain but wasn't willing to give up. "We're going to protect our family, and we'll do whatever it takes to bring Anthony back to us. I won't let those people take away what we have left." Anthony, with tears in his eyes, nodded. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. The struggle for truth and justice was just beginning, but now they were united, and Brandon knew that, although danger still loomed, this family had a new chance to heal and rebuild what the past had stolen from them. The day began to fade into shades of orange and pink, as Brandon, Elizabeth, Karen, and Ashley returned home after a long, exhausting day. The twins walked beside them, small shadows of curiosity and innocence, though their minds were more troubled than anyone could imagine. Since all of this began, they had been silent witnesses to the tensions and revelations surrounding their family. The absence of their father had deeply marked their lives, and now that they knew he was alive, their questions only multiplied. "When will Dad come home?" Karen asked in a whisper as she looked at Brandon, her eyes filled with childlike hope. Brandon, walking with his hands in his pockets, looked down at the girl. He knew their situation was complicated, and while he wanted to give them clear and hopeful answers, he couldn't promise them anything. But he also wasn't about to crumble in front of them. Not now. "We're working on that, Karen," he said with a gentle smile. "Things can be tough sometimes, but we're not going to give up. And if your dad wants to come back, we'll do everything we can to make sure he returns safely." Karen nodded slowly, accepting the answer for now, though it was clear she wanted more. Ashley, who had remained silent all this time, squeezed her sister's hand as if seeking strength in that simple gesture. Brandon realized how important these girls had become in his life. Without noticing, he had become a figure of support, something more than just a detective trying to solve a mystery. In their eyes, he could see how they looked at him, as if he had gone from being a stranger to someone they deeply trusted. For them, Brandon was a pillar, a man who wasn't just helping their mother, but was also filling the void left by their father's absence. With every passing day, he felt that these girls were in some way part of him too. "Brandon," Ashley suddenly said, breaking her usual silence. "Why are you doing this? I mean, you're not family, but you care for us like you are." Brandon stopped for a moment, surprised by the little girl's direct question. He looked at Ashley, her eyes deep and serious for a child her age, and crouched down to be at her level. "Well, Ashley," he began, "sometimes family isn't just the people you're related to by blood. Sometimes you find people who matter to you just as much as if they were your own family. And you two," he smiled, looking at both girls, "have shown me that I can be part of something bigger. You've given me a reason to keep going, to help, and that means a lot to me." Ashley nodded, as if she understood the complexity of his words, and then stepped forward to hug him. Karen quickly followed suit, and for a moment, Brandon felt something inside him begin to heal. He had lost his son, but here, with these girls and Elizabeth, he was starting to gain something new, something he had never expected. Elizabeth, who had been watching the scene from a distance, smiled tenderly. Though her life had been a roller coaster of emotions since discovering the truth about Anthony, she knew that having Brandon by their side gave them the strength to move forward. He had become a father figure to the girls, and that filled her with gratitude. Amidst so much chaos and pain, Brandon had been the rock on which they all leaned. Days went by, and the investigation into Anthony's connections with organized crime advanced slowly but steadily. Brandon was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. He knew that not only Anthony's life was at stake, but also the safety of Elizabeth and the girls. Every clue he found brought him a little closer to the web of criminals that had pushed Anthony to fake his death. One afternoon, while reviewing old files in his office, something clicked in his mind. One of the names that had appeared in several documents related to Anthony belonged to an old acquaintance from the organized crime world in Dallas, a man named Victor Rosales. Rosales was a big player in the city, someone who operated in the shadows, but whose influences were deep and dangerous. If Anthony had been in contact with him, the situation was much graver than he had thought. "Damn it," Brandon muttered as he reviewed the notes once more, confirming what he feared. Without wasting time, he picked up the phone and called Elizabeth. They needed to talk immediately. "Elizabeth, I think I've found something important," he said as soon as she answered. "What's going on?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tense. Anthony was in contact with a man named Victor Rosales. He's a well-known name in organized crime circles in Dallas. If Anthony was involved with him, it could explain why he had to disappear. Rosales is not someone you can just walk away from. Elizabeth fell silent for a moment, processing the information. "And what does that mean for us?" she finally asked. It means we're dealing with people who have no scruples, Elizabeth. Rosales and his crew won't let Anthony come back just like that. We have to be careful, very careful. But it also means we're one step closer to understanding exactly what happened. Elizabeth took a deep breath. She knew the situation wasn't easy, but they couldn't give up now. Brandon, thank you for everything you're doing. I don't know what we would do without you. Brandon smiled, even though the gravity of the situation still weighed on him. You don't have to thank me, Elizabeth. This isn't over, but we'll do whatever it takes to bring Anthony back and keep you and the girls safe. As Brandon hung up the phone, he felt a renewed determination. The fight wasn't over, but with every step they took, they were closer to uncovering the whole truth. The twins, Karen and Ashley, continued to be his driving force, his reason not to give up. They deserved to have their father back, and he was determined to do everything in his power to make it happen. He knew the road ahead was fraught with danger, but now he had something he hadn't had since Logan's death, a reason to fight. And though the wounds of his loss would never completely disappear, the family he was forming with Elizabeth and the girls gave him a new hope. The night was thick, and the air felt heavier than usual when Brandon's phone rang. His heart, which had been relatively calm after days of important breakthroughs in the investigation, began to race. It wasn't common to receive calls at this hour, and the tone of the phone felt ominous. Upon answering, the voice he heard on the other end was not just any voice. It was cold, calculated, and though it barely murmured, the message was loaded with an unmistakable threat. We know what you're doing, Brandon. If you want to protect that family, you'd better stop right now, or the consequences will be severe for everyone. Brandon fell silent, the threat echoing in his mind like an endless refrain. It wasn't the first time someone had threatened him in his career as a detective, but this time the risk felt more personal. It wasn't just about him anymore. There were Elizabeth, the twins, and even Anthony. He knew these people weren't joking, and that if they had reached the point of threatening him directly, it was because they felt cornered. "I'm not afraid," he replied calmly, although the tension in his voice was palpable. The call abruptly ended without further words. Brandon stared at his phone, aware that the decisions he made from that moment on would define the future for everyone involved. He quickly made his way to Elizabeth's house. When he arrived, she was already awake, her eyes reflecting the same fear he felt. "I got a call," Brandon said bluntly. "They're warning us to stop investigating. They know we're close to uncovering the truth." Elizabeth tensed up, but her eyes showed nothing but determination. They had come too far to back down now. "We can't stop now, Brandon," she said firmly. "If we do, we'll never know what really happened to Anthony. We can't keep living in fear." Brandon looked at her, recognizing in her the same strength that had kept him steadfast throughout the investigation. He knew she was right. Although the danger was real, they couldn't give up when they were so close to closing the case. "You're right," he said. "We can't stop, but we need to be more careful. We have to ensure everything is in order before making any moves. We can't afford to let anything slip." The following days were tense. Every step they took in the investigation brought them closer to the truth, but it also heightened the danger. However, Brandon and Elizabeth's persistence began to pay off. Little by little, they started gathering evidence that directly implicated the criminal organization in the events that led to Anthony's disappearance. The evidence included testimonies from people who had worked with Anthony in the past, as well as documents revealing illegal transactions and connections to key figures in organized crime in Dallas, including Victor Rosales. With his field experience, Brandon had managed to unearth data that the police had never been able to discover. Finally, the moment to act arrived. Brandon knew they couldn't confront such a powerful organization on their own. So, he contacted the police, sharing everything he had uncovered. With the authorities' help, they organized a series of raids at several key locations around the city where they knew the main players involved in Anthony's case operated. The day of the raids arrived, filled with a mix of tension and relief. Brandon, Elizabeth, and the twins took refuge in a safe place while the police prepared to act. Despite the constant threat, Elizabeth remained steadfast, knowing that they were finally about to put an end to the nightmare that had consumed her life for the past 4 years. When the raids began, the city buzzed with anticipation. Brandon received constant updates from the police station. One by one, the main members of the criminal organization were arrested, including Victor Rosales, the man who had orchestrated Anthony's disappearance. It was a significant blow to the criminal world, and the success of the raids ensured that Anthony and his family would finally be safe. News of the arrests came shortly after Rosales was taken into custody. Brandon, Elizabeth, and the twins embraced tightly, knowing that while challenges lay ahead, the greatest danger had passed. For the first time in a long while, Elizabeth could breathe a little easier. It didn't take long before Anthony, after years of living in the shadows, could finally return to his family. The reunion was emotional, filled with tears and hugs. Karen and Ashley, who had grown up without their father, clung to him as if they feared losing him again. For Anthony, it was a mix of relief and pain. He knew he had done what he felt was necessary to protect his family, but he also understood the emotional cost of his decisions. Elizabeth, although devastated by everything they had endured, remained steadfast in her love for Anthony. Despite all the suffering, she understood that her husband had acted out of desperation, and while the road to rebuilding would be long, she was willing to walk it by his side. "Nothing will be the same, I know," Anthony said as he held Elizabeth in his arms. "But the important thing is that I'm here now. I'm sorry for everything." Elizabeth looked into his eyes, her own tears mingling with his. "It doesn't matter what happened before. We're here now, together. That's what matters." Brandon watched the scene from a respectful distance. He had fulfilled his mission. He had found the truth and helped a family reunite. But what he hadn't anticipated was how much this family would mean to him. As he watched Anthony embrace his daughters and wife, he couldn't help but feel that, in some way, he had gained something in all of this too. Though he had lost his own son, he had found a new purpose, a new family. The path to normalcy wouldn't be easy. Anthony would still have to face the aftermath of having faked his death and gotten involved with such dangerous people. The family would have to learn to live with the scars that the past had left, but they would do it together, and that was what mattered most. With a mix of satisfaction and melancholy, Brandon bid farewell to the family that afternoon. He knew he would always have a place in their lives, but he also understood this was their moment to heal and rebuild. "Thank you, Brandon," Elizabeth said, her smile filled with gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Brandon smiled faintly and nodded. "You don't have to thank me. I'll always be here if you need me." With one last look at the family, Brandon walked away, knowing that although the case was closed, his connection with them would last forever. The afternoon sun gently caressed the grass in the cemetery, where the wind blew lightly, bringing with it a sense of calm. Brandon, Elizabeth, Anthony, and the twins walked through the same paths that, just months ago, had witnessed confusion and pain. Now, the atmosphere was different, not because the wounds had completely healed, but because there was an air of resolution. The shadows of uncertainty and fear had dissipated, leaving space for something that resembled peace. The twins, Karen and Ashley, walked alongside their parents, hands intertwined. They had lived through experiences that girls their age should never have had to face. But time and the love of their parents had made them stronger. Today, they were not only there to take another step toward reconciliation with their past, but also to support Brandon in an act that, while simple, was profoundly significant. Brandon, with his shoulders a bit straighter than usual, held a bouquet of fresh flowers in his hands. He stopped in front of Logan's grave, and everyone present did the same. The old worn and confusing headstone had been replaced with a new one, now bearing the correct name of his son. Logan, engraved in stone, gleamed under the sunlight. "This is the place that belongs to him," Brandon said softly as he knelt to lay the flowers at the foot of the new headstone. Elizabeth approached slowly, tears already welling in her eyes. She knew this moment was crucial not only for Brandon, but for all of them. Logan had been a silent figure in the story they had just traversed, yet he had been present with them every step of the way. And although Brandon had dedicated all his efforts to help Elizabeth and her family find answers, he had never stopped carrying the weight of losing his own son. "Logan would be proud of you, Brandon," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. You gave us a family. You gave us hope." Brandon, still kneeling, nodded his head, unable to speak at that moment. Elizabeth's words echoed in him, filling him with a mix of gratitude and sadness. He had found some peace, but he also knew that the grief for his son would never completely fade. However, the fact that Logan was now resting in the place he deserved, that his name would be remembered with dignity, brought him a small measure of comfort. Anthony, who had remained silent, stepped forward. Although his own life was marked by the shadow of his mistakes and decisions, today he stood there with his family. He knew that his return had been complicated and that the road to reconciliation with his wife and daughters would be long, but being there with them in that moment reminded him that there was still hope. "Thank you for everything, Brandon," Anthony said, his voice serious but full of sincerity. "What you did for me, for Elizabeth, and for our daughters. I can never repay you." Brandon slowly got up, brushing the dirt from his knees, and looked at Anthony. Despite everything they had been through, they both knew they were entering a new chapter, one that allowed them to look toward the future with more clarity. "You don't have to repay me anything, Anthony," Brandon replied. "The truth was the only thing that mattered, and now that you have it, all that's left is to move forward." Karen and Ashley, who had been listening quietly, approached their father and hugged him tightly. They had spent so much time wondering why he hadn't been with them, and although the answers hadn't been easy to understand, they now had the opportunity to start anew. "Dad, we're happy you're here," Karen said, her eyes shining with a maturity beyond her years. Anthony hugged them back just as tightly, his emotions running high. "Me too, girls. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to rebuild this together." Brandon watched that scene with a slight smile. The twins had been the driving force behind everything. Their questions and innocence had pushed Elizabeth not to give up. Now their relationship with their father had a second chance, a chance Brandon knew they would cherish deeply. "It's time to say goodbye," Elizabeth said, looking at Logan's new headstone with respect. "Thank you, Logan, for bringing us together, for giving us a new opportunity." Elizabeth's words resonated in the air as everyone, in silence, bid farewell to Logan. Although they hadn't known him personally, they felt that in some way he had been a part of this healing process. Brandon, for his part, lingered a few moments longer by the grave while Elizabeth, Anthony, and the twins began to walk away slowly. He stayed there, gazing at the headstone, allowing the memories of his son to wash over him. The sadness remained, as it always would, but there was something more. There was gratitude, there was a sense of closure, albeit incomplete, and there was peace. Finally, Brandon turned and walked toward the family that, unwittingly, had become his own. He knew that life would still be complicated, that grief wouldn't magically disappear, but now there was a future that appeared clearer. The scars they all carried wouldn't vanish, but together they could find ways to heal. When he reached Elizabeth, Anthony, and the girls, Brandon felt part of something larger than the pain. He felt part of a family that, despite everything, had found the truth, had overcome the sorrow, and was now ready to face the future. As they left the cemetery, the wind blew gently, carrying away the weight of the past days, and while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Brandon knew that now, more than ever, there was hope. Dear friends, we hope you enjoyed this story as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do so. Your subscription means the world to us and helps us keep sharing amazing and heartfelt stories with you. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. Did you like the story? Please leave a comment and let us know what you think. It helps us continue creating stories that resonate and inspire. Right now, a playlist of more stories from our channel is appearing on your screen. We invite you to explore and enjoy these other captivating tales. Thank you for being part of our journey. We look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Until next time.